A pleasant morning to each and everyone. I am Chris Ibo. For today's motivation, do not let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do by John Wooden. John Wooden's quote means that you shouldn't focus on your limitations or what you are unable to do. Instead, concentrate on your strengths and the things you are capable of accomplishing. Letting obstacles or weaknesses hold you back prevents you from making progress with the abilities you do have. For today's discussion, we will going to tackle about the total physical response. Ms. Dayuday will discuss first what is the total physical response and how total physical response means.
Thank you, Miss Ivo. So today, I'll be discussing the total physical response, or the TPR, a dynamic language teaching method that harness the power of movement to enhance language acquisition and retention. So TPR stands for Total Physical Response, is a language teaching methods by James Asher that combines language learning with physical movement. Instructor gives commands in the target language and students respond using whole body action. So TPR, it's a unique approach to language teaching that emphasizes the connection between language and physical actions. This method was developed by James Asher, a professor of psychology. There are key points to remember. First is the language and movement. So, language and the movement, the core idea of TPR is that learning a language is easier when it's linked to physical actions. So, like when you hear a command like jump and then perform the action of jumping, it helps your brain connect the word jump with the physical act of jumping. Next is the instructor lead commands. So in TPR, the teacher plays an active role. So they give commands in the target language such as walk to the door or sit down or raise your hand. So next is the student response. So the students then respond by physically carrying out the commands. So this active involvement helps them to understand and remember the language more effectively. So, like for example, in a classroom activity, the teacher says, stand up, so the student will stand up. Or in a game, if the teacher says, touch your nose, so the students will touch their noses. And also in a role play, if the teacher says, pretend you're a dog, so bark, so the student will bark. So, in essence, TPR creates a fun and engaging learning environment where students not only learn new words but also practice using them in a meaningful way. And next, this method uses the comprehension approach to language teaching. Listening and responding with action helps learners quickly recognize meaning and passively absorb language structure. Grammar isn't explicitly taught but learned. Through input, TPR is effective for learning vocabulary, especially idiomatic terms like phrase terms. Comprehension approach grammar. So, TPR is a language teaching method that prioritizes comprehension over production. This means that students are encouraged to understand the language first before they are asked to speak it. There are also key points to remember. First is the listening and responding. So in TPR, students mainly listen to the teacher's command and respond physically. This listening practice helps them to first is recognize meaning. So understand the meaning of the words and phrases used in the commands. Next is the language structure. So gradually internalize the grammatical patterns and structures of the language. Next is the implicit grammar. Unlike traditional language teaching methods that focus on explicit grammar rules, TPR emphasizes implicit learning, and this means that students learn grammar naturally through exposure to the language and by using it in context. They don't need to memorize rules or do grammar exercises. Next is the vocabulary acquisition. So TPR is particularly effective for learning vocabulary, especially idiomatic terms. So when students hear a command like pick up the ball, they associate the phrase pick up with the action of lifting the object. So this helps them to remember the phrase and its meaning. So like for example again in a classroom activity, if the teacher says walk to the door, so the students walk to the door. So while doing this, they are unconsciously learning the verb tense and structure of the command. Next is the game. So if the teacher says touch your head, so the students touch their head. So they are learning the preposition your and the body part head in a natural context. Next is in a role play. So if the teacher says, pretend you're a bird, so fly. So the students fly. So they are learning the verb fly and the present tense form. So in summary, TPR is a method that emphasizes understanding and natural language acquisition. So by focusing on comprehension and using physical actions, students can effectively learn vocabulary and grammar without the need for explicit instruction. So now, next is that Asher developed TPR after observing how children learn language where parents' speech is often followed by a child physical response. So he formed three key of hypotheses from this observation. First is the language is learned primarily by listening. Second is the language learning must engage the right hemisphere of the brain. And lastly, the learning language should not involve any stress. So Asher's hypothesis, or James Asher, the creator of the total physical response, based his methods on observation of children learning their first language. So his observation led him to propose three hypotheses. So the first is the language is learned primarily by listening. Second is language learning must engage the right hemisphere of the brain. And lastly, the learning language should not involve any stress. So first is language is learned primarily by listening. So Asher believed that children learn their native language primarily by listening to their parents and other around them. So they gradually acquire vocabulary and grammar through exposure to spoken language. So this is similar to how babies learn to understand speech before they can produce it. Next is the language learning engages the right hemisphere of the brain. So Asher suggested that language learning primarily involves the right hemisphere of the brain. So this is contrary to the traditional beliefs that language learning is primarily a left brain function. Next is the language learning should not involve any stress. So Asher emphasizes that language learning should be a stress-free experience. He believes that stress can hinder language acquisition and create anxiety in learners. So this hypothesis influenced the development of TPR, which is designed to be a low-stress and comprehension-based approach to language learning. So next, TPR is often used alongside other methods and techniques. It is popular with beginners and with young learners, although it can be used with students of all levels and all age groups. So the total physical response is a teaching method that combines language learning with physical movement. So it's a popular approach, especially for beginners and young learners, as it makes language learning fun and engaging. So students perform action in response to spoken commands in the target language, naturally acquiring vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. While often associated with young learners, TPR or the total physical response can be adapted to suit students of all levels and ages, creating a positive and effective learning environment. And lastly, how TPR works. So the teacher gives commands such as stand up or walk to the door. and students physically respond by performing the action. So, as students became more comfortable, they begin to give commands and even add complexity, helping them transition from comprehension to production. So, overall, TPR is an excellent approach for early stages of language acquisition and for introducing new vocabulary in an engaging and interactive way. So TPR works by having students perform actions in response to spoken commands in the target language. For example, a teacher might say jump and the students would jump. So this physical action helps students associate the word jump with the corresponding movement, making it easier to remember and use. So TPR is based on the idea that language learning is more effective when it's connected to real-world experiences and also in physical actions. So, by associating words with action, students can develop a deeper understanding of the language and improve their pronunciation and fluency. So, additionally, TPR creates a fun and engaging learning environment that can help students stay motivated and interested in learning. And that would be all my part. And now I will give the virtual floor to Miss Aibo so that she can discuss when to use TPR or the total physical response.
Thank you so much, Ms. Dayuday. So now let's move forward to the topic when to use total physical response. So there are four situations that we have to use the total physical response. During early language learning, engaging kinesthetic learners, low stress learning, and lastly, the teaching action oriented vocabulary. So first, we have the early language learning. So it is highly effective for teaching young children or beginners, especially in acquiring basic vocabulary and commands in a new language. For example, the teacher says sit down and sits down. The students copy the teacher. They learn the meaning of sit down by doing the action. So, engaging kinesthetic learners. It works well for learners who benefit from movement and physical activity to enhance retention and understanding. For example, the teacher says jump and jumps up and down. The students jump too. The movement helps active students remember the word jump. The third one is the low stress learning. Total physical response can create a low anxiety environment, allowing learners to acquire language in a more relaxed and natural way without the pressure of speaking immediately. For example, the teacher says stand up, but doesn't ask the students to say it back. The students just stand up, they listen, follow, and learn without needing to speak right away. And the last one is teaching action oriented vocabulary. It is useful for teaching It is useful for teaching verbs, prepositions, and other words that can be easily associated with physical actions. For example, sit, stand, open, and close. For example for this is the teacher says open the door and then opens the door. The students watch and copy. By seeing the action, they understand the meaning of open the door. In conclusion, total physical response is a powerful and effective approach to language learning, particularly in engaging students in a fun, interactive way. By connecting language with physical actions, learners can internalize new words and phrases more naturally and with less pressure. As educators, it's important to explore such methods that cater to different learning styles and make the learning experience more dynamic. I encourage all of you to consider how you might implement total physical response in your own classrooms to to enhance engagements and comprehension. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you feel inspired to try total physical response in your teaching or learning journey.